Indeed, and thank you, Cormac, for that. Really, I want to pick up where Cormac left off. The economic inequality, what can be done? When we did the report, we initially were looking into a lot of the policy implications, but we felt it's important to step away from preferring any particular policy to simply describe the situation. So as you'll see when you get a chance to go through the report, there's a lot of detail describing economic inequality in Ireland as we define it across the different domains. But there is a need for a policy framework that's holistic to address economic inequality. And Professor Atkinson pointed to a lot of the levers that are available to move on the issue. But there's also a research agenda, and the two are interwoven. We really want to deal with inequality, but we need to know more about it, and we need to do more to address it. So what I want to do here is, these are the kind of things we listed in the report. We didn't go much further than listing them, but I want to just say a bit about both the policy agenda mixed in with the research agenda in order to address economic inequality. And the first question, which is in a way a political economy question as well as a research question, is, are we looking for a single dial or a multiple indicator dashboard? This idea that you need to see more than just one measure. And on the one hand, you have your air speed, how fast is your airplane going? Maybe that's enough to get you to your destination, but would you be more comfortable if your pilot had a range of other information available to them so that they can respond to different things that might arise? And indeed, do we believe that running the economy, or indeed trying to maintain a welfare state and to address inequality, requires us to look at a great deal of indicators and a great deal of information and be responsive to it? And of course, I'm arguing for the latter case. Nonetheless, the silver bullet is often growth. We need GDP growth, and of course there's many good reasons for that. Employment grows, unemployment falls. They're lag indicators, okay, that they arise some years after the economy begins growing again, but of course it's absolutely vital that we get more work and more quality work. And of course, once the economy begins to grow, welfare claims go down, tax rates go up, it's easier to fund public services, poverty falls, and of course it's an easy message. We need growth once we can get the economy going again. So I'm not dismissing growth or the importance of continuing to develop our economy. It's absolutely vital. But what I am saying is that alongside a focus on that single indicator, we need to look at a great deal of other things, and indeed to weigh, not to balance. Sometimes we might want a little less growth if it means we can have a bit more economic equality. So there are limits to GDP growth. There's never enough growth. We had a 15-year extended boom period, albeit sustainable for the second half, but nonetheless there are still areas of Ireland untouched by that. There's still areas close to the city centre where trees grow out of buildings, so obviously the growth didn't touch everywhere. We know with climate change, resource depletion, the very structure of our economy in terms of the different elements of our GDP, our output, some of them are not sustainable and need to change. And of course, no matter how big your economy is, the richest countries in the world suffer from some social problems, social exclusion, drug addiction and so on, which are not just about GDP growth, they're about social policy which is tailored to those problems. And of course we see that GDP growth is increasingly associated with the income and wealth inequality, which we see in the report, which in turn leads to negative social and economic consequences. So what we propose in the report is essentially a broader model of economic inequality. Cormac showed that sort of spiral of the different elements, but it's another way of looking at it here. We want to look at people's income, but also their wealth, and not just their gross income and wealth, but their net income. So that's the first line there, your income plus your wealth minus the amount of taxation you pay on that. It's basically how much money you've got in terms of your savings and your income. But we also want to include the value of public services, that they have a cash value in people's lives. This is a challenge to calculate, but nonetheless it needs to be part of the debate, because you can give people more money through increasing their income or lowering taxation, but they will have fewer public services, so they have to put their hand in their pockets, and they're not actually better off in terms of in real economic terms. And of course the cost of living can change. Again, we can give people more cash, but if that just drives price inflation in the economy, then again people are not better off, and that price inflation may help exacerbate the inequality. So the top 5 pieces, if you like, are what we're calling net economic benefit. That we really want to look at the distribution of net economic benefit in the economy. And it's easier said than done in terms of the available data, as I'll discuss, but that's the goal. But of course we want to compare like with like. Somebody who is a a single individual working is not the same as a couple who have 2 or 3 children. It's not the same as a single parent. It's not the same as somebody who has a disability, who has additional costs of living. So we need to find common denominators. My denominator word jumped sideways there, but you can see it there. So to equalise out per household, per person, per adult, when we're talking about the distribution of net economic benefit. So that's what we're talking about. When we're talking about economic inequality, we're talking about inequality in the distribution of net economic benefit. And of course, that has the important implication. Not everybody has to have the same level of cash income. We might be able to improve people's net economic position through stronger public services or through reducing the cost of living through price regulation or whatever. So there are more options there. Just keeping an eye on the time. So what do we know? We know what we don't know. We have a basis to work from in Ireland in terms of data. And obviously the report uses available data and also data that's replicated, that's going to be available to us every year, so the report can be updated so we can see more clearly how this is changing over time. But at the same time, there's no definitive work in Ireland on the distribution of income, which is insane when you think about it. That we're concerned about the distribution of income, and yet we can't really nail down the distribution. We rely on survey data, very aggregated, very much average data for deciles or for different groups. Revenue potentially has capacity to provide a lot more data than they do, but it's not their job to provide statistics. And even there, sometimes you have tax units that are one person, sometimes a couple is a single tax unit, and there's difficulties disaggregating that. So there are known problems with the data. We have a new wealth survey that's very useful. And we have, likewise, a lack of data on the public services, which is a big challenge to social scientists. But we do have reasonably good data on material circumstances, family composition, and people's capacities, but we need more to link that into the economic data. So, what can be done? Well, with better data, we could indeed measure net economic benefit. We need to invest in better data. In the report, you'll see there's a dashboard. This is the second best thing. In the absence of a single measure of net economic benefit, I know you can't see that there, these are the kind of indicators we look at. Percentage of households that are jobless, the tax to GDP ratio in Ireland, how much of gross income do the top 10% have, how much of wealth do the top 10% have. And by monitoring a range of statistics, not just about income and wealth, but also about access to public services, the cost of childcare, the highest or second highest in the OECD, and a whole range of other available data, we can begin to look at economic inequality in much more multidimensional terms. The biggest challenge, I think, for social scientists and also for those who want to protect the welfare state is to show the value of public services. Survey data in the UK, recent surveys showing people don't really know how education and health are funded. People don't see the connection in an intuitive way between the tax they pay, the services they receive. And I think there's a job of work needed on multiple levels to do that research to show the value, but also to communicate to people better about actually we do get a great deal of public services, as you'll see in the report, for the taxes we pay, but it's not always obvious to people. In terms of economic inequality, one of the things there is meeting people's basic material needs, and there's a long list there. We need to agree and consolidate existing standards about what we mean by, for example, adequate housing. What is adequate housing? If people have a 2-hour commute, or if it's very small size, or if people are overcrowded, is it adequate? Or of course we have many people who are on the uncertainty of rental accommodation, fear of the rent going up, fear that they don't have security of tenure, and a feeling that they can't establish a family in those circumstances in some cases. So we need to look at what we mean by adequacy across these domains. We have a lot of material already there, but of course we need to make it clear to people what they get for their tax money when these services are provided or regulated as public services. Living incomes, others have touched on it, so again I'm conscious of time, so I'm flying through a number of proposals here, but we need to look at the relationship when incomes go up, how do prices change, particularly the basket of goods and services that people on low incomes rely on, because there's often a chasing game. You know, low pay goes up, the price of things goes up, and people at the bottom never manage to reach a point of having an adequate income. We need to look at those relationships in more detail, and of course we need to look at those who, for whatever reason, I don't know what I did there, but for whatever reason cannot work. Now, I think I pressed the escape button there, so bear with me while I go back. to where I want to be, nearly there. So, when you have the big dashboard, you do have to be careful what button you press. So the issue of a living wage, I think, has a lot of popularity among the public. I think it's a winner in terms of that. But of course, getting there is difficult. Employers say they can't afford to pay the current calculation of $11.45 an hour. Well, we don't have to just look at wages. If we could provide childcare, if we could produce rent control, we could lower how much money people need. And it's that, again, looking at the other factors involved. It's not all about cash in people's pockets. And of course, carers do work full time, they just don't get properly remunerated for it. We need to look at, do they have a living wage, a living income? And likewise, people with disabilities with additional costs. Which brings us to the question of tax versus cash. I think it's important that more research is needed to compare the costs involved in the production of public services through tax-funded services versus when people pay for them in the market out of their own cash, versus when such as insurance methods are used to, so people pay for services but they can recoup that from their insurance or their social insurance, as is done much more in the European countries. We need to look at these different models in more detail for Ireland to give ourselves more options. And again, I suppose that's part of the research agenda, but again feeds into the possibilities, particularly because social insurance is so low in Ireland, that if we are to raise taxation, almost certainly we need to look at social insurance. We have the lowest level of social insurance across the EU. So we need to look at, do we want to have more of a social insurance system? And again, there's the question of how goods are produced in the public, private and voluntary sector in relation to how does that create the cost of living, the cost of goods and services, and relating that back to issues of people's income distribution. And of course that allows lots of possibilities in relation to the regulation of goods and services, such as rent control, which I mentioned earlier, but there's lots of others. Which brings us really to the punchline, which is not obvious, which is not a surprise, which is that we need to look at taxes and social insurance. I mean, others have already mentioned it, Cormac mentioned it there. I mean, there's many advantages of increasing taxes and social insurance. We can reduce the net income and wealth inequality, dealing with the rise of gross incomes. But we can also, by putting in very high rates of tax for very high earners, persuade companies it's just not worth their while paying millions of euros to CEOs, that they should keep the money in the company for investment or to pay other people. That there's actually no great benefit if you pay somebody 15 million as opposed to 1.5 million. It's just excess, and there's no need for it. And of course, we can fund public services. We have a growing population and an aging population. There are a lot of the additional spending on public services that we've seen the last year or so is in response to population changes. More older people, more younger people needing primary schools. We're only keeping pace with that. And so there's a challenge there. How are we really going to sustainably fund public services to meet our population changes? Likewise, to allow adequate incomes for people who cannot work, or need to fund those income supplements for people who are working part-time. And of course, climate change, moving away from fossil fuels, doing something about emissions from our agriculture, this all has to be addressed, and we're going to need funding to invest in the kind of serious structural changes in the economy, and taxation has to be part of that conversation. And of course, it will affect our competitive position. It could damage growth, it's done badly. It certainly could make us less competitive in some areas, but it can make us more competitive in other areas. We know that state investment in technologies, in third level education, in research, has helped fuel economic growth, and there's ways in which changing the balance of taxation can indeed be at least growth neutral, if not friendly to growth. So Cormac had a chart earlier showing Ireland's income tax system. And I think part of the political challenge, the geopolitical reality, is that if you just look at income tax, Ireland has a lower income tax for people who are on, say, 2/3 of average earnings than Britain or America, and far lower than France and Germany. That funny sign on top is a mixture of French and a German flag, which may become the European flag if Britain leaves. So, Professor Atkinson talked about the need for a 20 percentage point increase in the basic rate of taxation. When you look between Britain and America and the core European economies, you will see a 15% percentage point difference between the amount of actual tax paid by low-income workers in those countries, and that rises up. So you can see that even for those on 150 times, or sort of 150% of the average wage, 1.5 times, there's that 20 percentage points gap in the actual tax paid in Germany and France compared to Ireland. The Irish flag is hiding behind the Americans and British there, we're slightly higher. But of course the pressure on income tax is, you can see on the third set, for when people are earning 2.5 times the average wages, people earning 80, 100,000 or more, maybe in foreign multinationals, who could base themselves in London, who are perhaps American multinationals. Yes, those people would pay more income tax in Ireland, but they would pay a lot more in France or Germany. And it's a difficulty for Ireland trying to have it both ways. You know, we have one half, if you look at our statistics on migration, but also trade, one half is very much in the Anglosphere, the UK, the United States, and the liberal economies of the world. But the other half, in terms of both migration of people as well as our trade, is solidly with the European Union. And we're in between both. And it's a question of how do we, at the moment, tax policy is favouring reducing taxation closer to the British and the American. But that means less public services and less possibility that we can achieve anything like a core European welfare state. So I think there's a real challenge there. But of course we can't ignore our trading partners, that we want the foreign direct investment, we want the trade we have. So that's, I pose that as a question really, it's a balancing act, both for policymakers but also for researchers to work out, you know, can Ireland as a small country find a way to balance these things sustainably? And of course, we know that many core European countries have much higher taxation, but remain highly competitive. Because of course, through that taxation, they fund public services, a quality of life, state investment in R&D, in basic scientific research, in infrastructure, which are crucially important for the economy. And of course, Ireland could do more of that too. And can we afford it? Well, increasing evidence that if we increase economic inequality, such as that recent IMF working paper, that if we give more money to those who have least money, lo and behold, the economy will grow more, whereas if we give more money to those who already have enough, the economy will grow a lot less. And there's no real surprise in that, but what's crucially important is the empirical evidence is now reinforcing that, and of course there's a need for more of that data. And of course, what's the goal? Why do we want GDP growth back to the single indicator? Well, we want it because we want to achieve full employment. But why do we want to achieve full employment? Well, we want to give people a decent standard of living and a fair share of the output of our economy. And if that's the real end goal, then we need to focus more of our policies on, are we achieving that when we see GDP growth or other change in the economy? Are we achieving our end goal of giving everybody a much better quality of life and a more equal economy as a result? So I leave you with that question. Thank you very much.